They say a judge sees humanity at its most broken, shattered families, lost children, parents who forgot what love means. For 15 years, Judge Richard Caldwell carried their stories, each verdict weighing on his conscience. He thought he understood pain. He thought he understood loss. Until an 8-year-old boy walked into his courtroom, holding a worn photograph like a weapon, one look into those familiar eyes, and 15 years of carefully constructed certainty crumble, because sometimes fate has its own way of delivering justice, and sometimes it arrives in the form of a child who spent 8 years learning that fathers are just another word for broken promises. 3 words will shatter his world. You abandon me. The gavel falls, the courtroom goes silent, and Judge Richard Caldwell is about to learn that the hardest cases are the ones that come home. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. Late morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Courtroom 307, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. The imposing chamber held its usual air of formality, but today, something felt different. Maybe it was the unusual silence, or perhaps it was the small figure sitting in the front row, his presence commanding attention despite his size. 8-year-old Elijah Carter sat perfectly still, his small frame nearly swallowed by the massive wooden bench. His foster care lawyer, Sarah Mitchell, sat beside him, occasionally glancing at the child with poorly concealed concern. The boy's hollow expression and rigid posture spoke volumes about the weight he carried on his young shoulders. All rise for the Honorable Judge Richard Caldwell. The bailiff's voice echoed through the chamber as the side door opened. Judge Richard Caldwell entered with his characteristic measured stride, his black robes flowing behind him. At 42, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had spent years commanding respect in this very room. Yet today, something made him pause, just for a fraction of a second, as his eyes swept across the courtroom. His gaze landed on Elijah, and an inexplicable unease settled in his stomach. The boy's eyes, far too old for his young face, seemed to bore right through him. In his tiny hands, Elijah clutched something, an old photograph, its edges worn and creased from constant handling. "Be seated," Richard announced, his voice steady despite his unsettled feelings. He picked up the case, file before him, labeled simply, "In the matter of Elijah Carter, permanent placement hearing." Sarah Mitchell rose from her seat. "Your Honor, we're here today regarding the permanent placement of Elijah Carter, currently in the foster care system. Elijah has been in temporary placement for 4 years now, and we're seeking to finalize a permanent arrangement." Richard nodded, his eyes scanning the documents before him. The boy hadn't spoken a word during any of the previous hearings. According to the notes, he barely spoke at all these days. Another tragic statistic in an overwhelmed system. "The court recognizes the importance of finding stable, permanent homes for children in the system," Richard began, his practiced words carrying across the quiet chamber. "We'll review the recommendations from—" He stopped abruptly. There, in the middle of the page, a name jumped out at him. Mother's name. Naomi Carter. The world tilted slightly. Naomi Carter. Images flashed through his mind. A warm smile. Dark eyes that crinkled at the corners. Laughter that could fill a room, but that was impossible. His family had told him she'd moved away, married someone else. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he turned the page. The dates. The timeline. Everything began to align in a horrifying pattern he couldn't ignore. "Your Honor?" Sarah Mitchell's voice seemed to come from far away. "Is everything all right?" Before Richard could respond, another voice cut through. The air, small but sharp as a blade, filled with years of pain. "You abandoned me." The words hung in the air like shattered glass. Every head in the courtroom turned toward their source. Elijah had risen to his feet, his small frame shaking with emotion. The photograph in his hands crumpled slightly in his tight grip. Richard's voice failed him. The room started to spin. "What did you say?" "You abandoned us," Elijah repeated, his voice growing stronger, years of silence giving way to a flood of raw emotion. "You left me and my mom. You never came back. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. The social worker half rose from her seat, reaching for Elijah, but the boy wasn't finished. Mom cried every night, he continued, tears now streaming down his face. She waited for you. She always waited. Even when she got sick, she said maybe you'd come back. Richard gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. His son. This was his son. The child he never knew existed. The child he had abandoned without even knowing. Order, he managed to croak out, but his authority had crumbled. The courtroom had erupted into confused whispers. Sarah Mitchell stared between her young client and the judge, her mouth open in shock. "Mr. Peterson," Richard called to his clerk, his voice barely steady, "please call Judge Harrison to take over this case immediately. I need to recuse myself." The clerk hurried out, but Richard barely noticed. His eyes were locked with Elijah's, his son's eyes. How had he not seen it before? They were Naomi's eyes, filled with the same intensity he had fallen in love with. "All those years ago, Elijah," he whispered. But the boy turned away, his small shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of the world. Sarah Mitchell had recovered enough to take charge. "Your Honor, given these extraordinary circumstances, I request an immediate recess until Judge Harrison can arrive." Richard nodded numbly. "Granted. Court is in recess." The words felt hollow in his mouth, as people began to move, talking. In hushed, urgent voices, Richard remained frozen behind his bench. Memories flooded back. Naomi's smile, their last fight, his parents telling him she had moved on, married someone else. All lies. His entire world had been built on lies. He watched helplessly as Elijah huddled closer to his lawyer, still clutching that photograph. Now Richard could see it clearly. It was of him and Naomi, taken during happier times. His heart clenched painfully in his chest. "I didn't know," he whispered, though no one could hear him. "Dear God, I didn't know." The bailiff approached, concern evident on his face. "Judge Caldwell, are you all right?" Richard couldn't answer. How could he be all right? He had just discovered he had a son who had suffered unimaginably because of his absence. A son who had waited in the foster care system for 4 years while he sat in this very courtroom, passing judgment on other families' lives. The irony was bitter enough to choke him. Through the growing chaos in the courtroom, Richard watched as Sarah Mitchell tried to comfort Elijah. The boy had retreated back into silence, his earlier outbursts seemingly having drained him of all energy. But his eyes, those haunting, familiar eyes, never left Richard's face. Judge Harrison arrived within minutes, her usual brisk efficiency, tempered by the gravity of the situation. Richard barely registered her presence as he stepped down from the bench, his legs unsteady. "Richard," she murmured as they passed each other. "Do you need—" He shook his head. What he needed was impossible. He needed the last 8 years back. He needed to undo the damage his ignorance had caused. He needed to understand how his whole life had been derailed by lies and manipulation. As he made his way to his chambers, Richard could feel every eye in the courtroom following him. The whispers grew louder, the story already beginning to spread. But none of that mattered. All he could think about was the boy, his son, and the years of pain reflected in those young eyes. The photograph in Elijah's hands haunted him. He remembered that day clearly now. It was taken at the park, just weeks before everything fell apart. Naomi had been laughing at something he'd said, her face radiant with joy. How had that happy moment led to this? In his chambers, Richard sank into his chair, his judicial robe suddenly feeling like a mockery. He had dedicated his life to justice, to doing what was right. Yet he had failed the 2 people who should have mattered most. The reality of the situation crashed over him in waves. Naomi had been pregnant when they separated. She had raised their son alone, gotten sick, died, all while he remained ignorant, believing his parents' lies about her marrying someone else and moving away. And Elijah, his son, had spent 4 years bouncing through the foster care system. 4 years of pain and uncertainty, while Richard sat in this very building never knowing the truth. The thought made him physically ill. A knock at his door startled him. "Come in," he called automatically, his voice rough. Sarah Mitchell entered, her professional composure slightly cracked. "Judge Caldwell, I think we need to talk." Richard nodded numbly. "Yes, we do." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "How is he?" "Back to not speaking," Sarah replied, sitting down. "But I think you gathered that's his usual state." "How long?" Richard's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "How long has he been carrying that photograph?" According to his file, it's one of the only things he had with him when he entered the system. After his mother died. Sarah's voice was gentle but direct. "Judge Caldwell..." "Richard, did you really not know?" Richard shook his head, the motion almost violent. "No, God, no. My parents. They told me Naomi had married someone else, moved away. I tried to find her at first, but..." He trailed off, the excuses tasting like ash in his mouth. "I see." Sarah's expression was unreadable. "Well, given the circumstances, I'm sure you understand that everything has changed now. Judge Harrison will handle the immediate proceedings, but..." "I need to fix this," Richard interrupted, his voice suddenly fierce. "I need to make this right." Sarah studied him carefully. "With all due respect, Your Honor, you can't just fix 8 years of absence overnight. Elijah has been through more than you can imagine. The foster care system. It hasn't been kind to him." The words hit Richard like physical blows. Each one added to the growing weight of his guilt, his responsibility. "Tell me," he demanded. "Tell me everything." But before Sarah could respond, another knock came at the door. Judge Harrison entered, her face grave. "Richard," she said softly, "I've recessed court for the day, but we need to address this situation immediately. The media will get wind of this soon, and we need to handle it properly." Richard barely heard her. His mind was still in the courtroom, still seeing Elijah's face as he spoke those devastating words. "You abandoned me." The truth of those words, even if he hadn't known about his son's existence, would haunt him forever. But now that he knew, now that he understood what had been stolen from him, from them both, he would do whatever it took to make things right, even if it meant destroying everything else in his life to do it. The chaos of the courtroom faded as Richard sat alone in his chambers, his world crumbling around him, the weight of revelation pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. As he closed his eyes, memories he'd locked away for years came rushing back, as vivid as if they'd happened yesterday. Years ago, the evening air was thick with jasmine as Richard walked across the university campus. He was a first-year law student then, full of ambition and ideals. That's when he first saw her. Naomi Carter, sitting under an old oak tree, surrounded by scattered papers and textbooks. She was studying for her teaching certification, her dark curls falling over her face as she concentrated. He remembered how she looked up when his shadow fell across her books, how her smile lit up her entire face. "You're blocking my light," she'd said, but her eyes sparkled with amusement. "Maybe I can make up for it by buying you coffee." The words had tumbled out before he could stop them. She'd laughed then, a sound that would become his favorite melody. "Bold of you to assume. I like coffee. Tea, hot chocolate, name your poison. Coffee will do just fine." That moment, that simple, perfect moment, had changed everything. Their love story unfolded like a dream. Late-night study sessions turned into deep conversations about their hopes and dreams. Naomi wanted to teach elementary school, to shape young minds and inspire creativity. Richard shared his passion for justice, his desire to make a difference in the world. "You're going to be an amazing judge someday," she'd tell him, tracing her fingers along his jaw. "Just don't forget about the little people when you're up there in your fancy robes." "Never," he'd promised, pulling her close. "You'll keep me grounded." They spent that summer lost in each other. Picnics in the park, spontaneous road trips to nowhere, dancing in the rain because Naomi insisted it was good luck. Richard had never felt so alive, so completely himself, as he did with her. But paradise couldn't last forever. The first cracks appeared when Richard's parents, James and Elizabeth Caldwell, discovered the relationship. The Caldwells were old money, pillars of society who had carefully planned their son's future since birth. A struggling teacher-to-be from the wrong side of town wasn't part of that plan. "She's using you, Richard," his mother had insisted over dinner at their mansion. "These girls always do. They see our name, our position in society, and they plot and scheme." "Naomi's not like that," Richard had defended, his voice rising. "She doesn't care about money or status. She loves me for who I am." His father's laugh was cold. "And who are you without the Caldwell name? Without the connections we've built? The opportunities we've created for you? Wake up, son. She's playing you for a fool." But Richard hadn't listened, not at first. He and Naomi moved into a small apartment together, determined to build their own life. They lived on instant noodles and dreams, and for a while, it was enough. Then the pressure began to mount. His parents froze his accounts. His prestigious internship mysteriously fell through. The dean of the law school called him in for a concerned discussion about his future prospects. "They'll never stop," Naomi had whispered one night, tears streaming down her face. "They'll destroy everything you've worked for." "I don't care," Richard had insisted, holding her tight. "None of it matters without you." But Naomi cared. She saw how the stress was affecting him, how the weight of his parents' disapproval was crushing his spirit. She loved him too much to watch him throw everything away. The fight started small, little disagreements that grew into deeper conflicts. Richard worked longer hours at his part-time job, trying to prove he could make it on his own. Naomi withdrew into herself, carrying a secret she couldn't bring herself to share. Then came the morning Richard found the note. "I can't be the reason. You lose everything. I love you too much for that. Please forgive me." He'd rushed to her workplace, her apartment, called every friend they shared. Nothing. She had vanished. When he finally broke down and went home, his mother was waiting with a sympathetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "She married someone else, darling," Elizabeth Caldwell said, patting his hand. "A man from her own background. It's for the best, really. Now you can focus on your future." Richard's world shattered. He threw himself into his studies, buried his pain under mountains of legal texts and case law. He excelled in every class, earned every honor, became exactly who his parents wanted him to be. But he never forgot her. What he didn't know, what his parents had hidden from him with calculated precision, was the truth. Every letter Naomi sent, every phone call she made, every attempt to reach him was intercepted and destroyed. While Richard climbed the ranks of the legal world, Naomi faced her pregnancy alone. She worked 2 jobs, studied whenever she could, and never gave up hope that somehow, someday, Richard would find his way back to them. The day Elijah was born, she wrote another letter. "He has your eyes, Richard. He's perfect in every way. I wish you could see him. I wish you knew how much we both need you." That letter, like all the others, was intercepted by Elizabeth Caldwell and burned in the fireplace of their mansion. Naomi kept writing, year after year. She told Richard about Elijah's first steps, his first words, how he loved stories and asked questions about everything. She described his gentle heart, his curious mind, his infectious laugh that reminded her so much of his father's. Each letter met the same fate, destroyed before Richard could know the truth about his son. Meanwhile, young Elijah grew, watching his mother work herself to exhaustion to provide for him. He saw her cry at night, holding an old photograph. He didn't understand then, but he knew the man in the picture was important. "That's your father," Naomi would tell him, her voice soft, with memory. "He would have loved you so much if he'd known about you. Sometimes good people get lost, baby, but that doesn't mean they stop being good." When Naomi fell ill, she tried one last time to reach Richard. Her hands shook as she wrote what would be her final letter. "Our son needs you. Please, if you ever loved me, find your way back to him. He deserves to know his father." But like all the others, this desperate plea never reached its intended recipient. Now, sitting in his chambers, Richard's mind spun with the weight of lost time. 8 years. 8 years of his son's life. Gone. 8 years of Naomi's struggle, her illness, her death. All while he lived in ignorant comfort, believing the lies his parents had fed him. The rage built slowly at first, then exploded like a tsunami. He grabbed his phone, dialing his father's number with trembling fingers. "Richard." James Caldwell's voice was smooth, controlled as always. "I'm in a meeting." "You knew." Richard cut him off, his voice deadly quiet. "You knew about my son." The silence on the other end was deafening. "Everything we did was for your own good," his father finally said. "That girl wasn't suitable. That girl was the love of my life," Richard roared. "She was carrying my child. You let her struggle alone. You let her die alone. You kept my son from me. Now, Richard, be reasonable." "Reasonable?" Richard laughed, a broken sound. "I just found out I have an 8-year-old son who thinks I abandoned him. He spent years in foster care while I sat in my courtroom, living the life you planned for me. Tell me, Father, what's reasonable about that?" "We did what we had to do to protect your future," his father's voice hardened. "Everything you are today." "Everything I am today is a lie," Richard interrupted. "A carefully constructed lie, built on the broken hearts of the people I loved most." He ended the call before his father could respond, the phone slipping from his numb fingers, the weight of truth pressed against him like a physical force. Every memory now held a different meaning. Every moment of success in his career felt hollow when measured against what he'd lost. While he'd been building his reputation as a fair and compassionate judge, his own son had been suffering in the foster care system. While he'd been living in his comfortable home, attending charity galas and society functions, Naomi had been fighting a lonely battle against illness. The irony was almost too much to bear. How many times had he presided over family court cases, making decisions about parents' rights and children's welfare? How many times had he lectured parents about their responsibilities, their obligations to their children? And all the while, his own child had been lost in the system. A knock at his chamber door startled him from his thoughts. Sarah Mitchell entered, carrying a thick file. "Judge Caldwell? I have Elijah's complete case history, if you want to." Richard reached for the file with trembling hands. Each page was another knife to his heart. Detailed reports of foster homes, school transfers, behavioral issues. The slow transformation of a happy toddler into a silent, withdrawn child. He stopped talking after his 3rd foster home, Sarah explained quietly. The trauma of losing his mother, then being moved from place to place. It took its toll. Richard's eyes fixed on a particular incident report. They locked him in a closet because he was crying for his mother? Sarah nodded grimly. Some foster homes were less than ideal. We tried to move him whenever we discovered problems, but that only meant more trauma, more abandonment. Richard finished, his voice hollow. While I was sitting in this building making decisions about other children's lives, my own son was suffering through this nightmare. He stood abruptly, moving to the window. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, where reporters were already beginning to gather. The story would break soon. Respected judge discovers abandoned son in his own courtroom. But Richard didn't care about the scandal, the damage to his reputation, the whispers that would follow him through these halls. All he cared about was the small boy with Naomi's eyes, who had carried the weight of abandonment for far too long. "I need to make this right," he whispered, more to himself than to Sarah. "Somehow, I need to make this right." "It won't be easy," Sarah warned. "Elijah has built walls around himself. Breaking through them will take time, patience, and probably more pain." Richard turned back to her, his face set with determination. "I abandoned him once, even if I didn't know it. I won't abandon him again. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'll prove to him that he has a father who wants him." As if to emphasize the challenge ahead, shouting erupted from the corridor outside. Richard recognized Elijah's voice, raw with emotion, screaming at someone to leave him alone. Without hesitation, he moved toward the door. Each step felt heavy with the weight of past mistakes, but also with the determination to make amends. The path ahead would be difficult. filled with pain and doubt and the ghosts of what might have been. But Richard Caldwell had finally found his way back to the truth, and he wouldn't lose it again. For Naomi's sake, for Elijah's sake, and for his own soul's redemption, he would fight to rebuild what his parents' lies had destroyed. The time for blind acceptance was over. The time for healing, no matter how painful, had begun. The morning after the courtroom revelation, Richard sat in his study, methodically reading through every page of Elijah's foster care file. Each report, each incident, each transfer felt like another nail in his heart. The story that emerged was one of systematic failure, not just his own, but of an entire system meant to protect children. 4 years earlier, 4-year-old Elijah sat in the back of a social worker's car, clutching his backpack. Inside were the only things he had left of his mother, her favorite scarf, the photograph of her with Richard, and a small notebook where she'd written stories for him. The social worker, Mrs. Thompson, kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, her eyes filled with pity. "You'll like the Petersons," she said, trying to sound cheerful. "They have 2 other children close to your age." Elijah didn't respond. He hadn't spoken since the morning he found his mother cold and still in her bed. The doctors had come, then the police, and finally, Mrs. Thompson. Everything happened so fast, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The Peterson house was big, with a neat lawn and wind chimes tinkling in the breeze. Inside, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson smiled too brightly, spoke too loudly, tried too hard to make him feel welcome. Their children, Tommy and Lisa, stared at him like he was an exotic animal in a zoo. That first night, Elijah cried for his mother. Mrs. Peterson came in, awkwardly patting his back. There, she said, clearly uncomfortable with his grief. "Big boys don't cry." But he couldn't stop. The tears came in waves along with desperate calls for his mama. That's when it started. The discipline. "If you can't be quiet," Mr. Peterson said sternly, "you'll have to stay in here until you learn." The closet was dark and small. Elijah, huddled in the corner surrounded by shoes and old coats, crying silently now. He learned quickly. Showing pain only made things worse. He lasted 2 months with the Petersons before Mrs. Thompson came back. "Sometimes the first placement doesn't work out," she explained as she drove him to his second home. "The Wilsons have more experience with trauma cases." The Wilsons were different, not better, just different. Mrs. Wilson ran her house like a military camp. Everything had to be perfect, scheduled, controlled. When Elijah spilled milk at breakfast one morning, her hand came down hard across his face. "Clumsy children. Don't get lunch," she declared. It wasn't the first time he'd gone hungry there, and it wouldn't be the last. Mr. Wilson was rarely home, but when he was, the tension in the house could be cut with a knife. He drank from a silver flask and yelled about everything. The other, foster kids, his wife's nagging, the bills that never seemed to end. One night, during one of Mr. Wilson's rages, Elijah hid under his bed, clutching his mother's photo. He whispered to it in the darkness, "Why did you leave me, Mama? Why didn't he want us?" The next morning, Mrs. Thompson found bruises on one of the other foster children. The Wilsons' license was suspended, and Elijah was moved again. By his third home, he'd stopped trying to unpack his backpack. What was the point? Nothing lasted. No one wanted him for long. The Hendersons seemed nice at first. They had a big house in the suburbs and took in several foster children at once. Mrs. Henderson liked to brag to her church friends about her charitable work with unfortunate children. But nice houses could hide ugly secrets. The food was carefully rationed, while the Hendersons ate elaborate meals. The foster children slept 3 to a room on thin mattresses, while the spare bedroom was kept pristine for guests. It was there that Elijah's voice began to fade. Words seemed pointless when nobody listened anyway. He watched, silent and observant, as other children came and went. Some cried and begged to stay when their time was up. Others ran away in the night, leaving behind small treasures and big dreams. The fourth home brought a glimmer of hope. Miss Angela lived alone in a modest apartment filled with books and the smell of fresh-baked cookies. She was different from the others. She actually saw him. "You don't have to talk," she told him on his first night there. "But I'm here when you're ready." She read to him every night, never demanding responses. When she found him looking at his mother's photo, she didn't try to distract him or tell him to move on. Instead, she sat with him, offering quiet company in his grief. For the first time since his mother died, Elijah felt safe. Miss Angela taught him to bake cookies, helped him with his homework, and never punished him for his nightmares. She even helped him create a special box for his mother's things, decorating it with stickers and ribbons. "Your memories are precious," she said. "We should keep them safe." But like everything else in Elijah's life, this happiness wasn't meant to last. Miss Angela got sick. Cancer, the doctors said. The same disease that took his mother. When they took him away, Miss Angela was crying. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," she whispered, hugging him tightly. "I wanted to keep you. I tried." Elijah didn't cry this time. He was 6 years old and he'd learned that tears changed nothing. The 5th home was the worst. The Taylors had 5 other foster children, all competing for limited resources and attention. The oldest, Marcus, was a teenager with anger issues and a mean streak. One day, Marcus found Elijah's special box. "What's this?" he taunted, holding up the photograph of Naomi and Richard. "Your mama and daddy? Where are they now, huh? Oh, right, they didn't want you." Elijah fought like a wild thing, but Marcus was bigger, stronger. The photograph ripped in the struggle, tears appearing across the smiling faces of his parents. When Mrs. Taylor found them, she punished them both equally. No dinner, no TV, early bedtime. She didn't care who started it or why. She never cared about the why of anything. That night, Elijah carefully taped the photograph back together. But it was never the same. Just like him, broken in ways that couldn't be fixed with tape and good intentions. The 6th home barely registered in his memory. By then, he was 7. And the world had taught him harsh lessons about trust and permanence. People left, people lied. Nothing stayed good for long. School became a blur of new classrooms, new faces, new teachers asking him to participate more and come out of his shell. He did the minimum required, never raising his hand, never joining games at recess. What was the point of making friends when he'd just be moved again? His social workers changed too. Mrs. Thompson retired, replaced by Mr. Garcia, then Miss Roberts, then others whose names he didn't bother to learn. They all said the same things. "We're trying to find you a permanent placement. The right family is out there. Don't lose hope." But hope was a luxury Elijah couldn't afford anymore. Hope hurt too much when it was inevitably crushed. By his 8th birthday, celebrated with a store-bought cupcake in yet another strange kitchen, Elijah had mastered the art of invisibility. He moved through days like a ghost, speaking only, when absolutely necessary, avoiding eye contact, taking up as little space as possible. The only time he showed any emotion was when he looked at the photograph. Late at night, under his covers with a flashlight, he would study his mother's face, trying to remember her voice, her laugh, the way she would sing him to sleep. But the man in the photo, his father, sparked different feelings. Anger, confusion, a deep ache that never went away. His mother had always said good things about him even at the end. "Your father would have loved you so much," she'd insisted. "Sometimes people get lost, but that doesn't mean they stop being good." Elijah wasn't sure he believed that anymore. Good people didn't abandon their families. Good people didn't let mothers die alone and children get lost in the system. Then came the day of the custody hearing. Another courtroom, another judge, another decision about his life that he'd have no control over. He sat there, clutching the worn photograph, not expecting anything to change. But everything changed when Judge Richard Caldwell walked in. The man from the photograph, older now, but unmistakable, successful, respected, completely unaware of the lives he'd destroyed with his absence. 8 years of pain, confusion, and anger exploded in that moment. Words Elijah had held back for years burst forth, cutting through the formal atmosphere like knives. You abandoned me. The shock on Richard's face, the way his hands trembled as he looked through the case file. None of it mattered. The damage was done. The years of loneliness, fear, and loss couldn't be erased by surprise or regret. Now, hours after the confrontation, Elijah sat in his current foster home, the 7th in 4 years, staring at the photograph. The faces smiled back at him, frozen in a moment of happiness that had shattered long ago. His father knew now. The truth was out. But knowledge couldn't change the past. It couldn't bring his mother back. It couldn't undo the years of trauma and neglect. Elijah carefully placed the photograph back in its protected sleeve. He'd learned the hard way to keep it safe. It was all he had left of both his parents, even if one of them was still alive. The social worker, his newest one, had tried to talk to him about what happened in court, about his father wanting to meet him, wanting to make things right. Elijah had retreated into his familiar silence. Making things right? How could anyone make this right? His mother was gone forever. His childhood was a wasteland of temporary homes and broken promises. His ability to trust, to hope, to believe in permanence, all gone. Even if his father hadn't known about him, even if there were reasons and explanations, the simple truth remained. Elijah Carter had grown up alone, unwanted, passed from home to home like an unwelcome package no one wanted to keep. That kind of damage didn't just go away because a man in a judge's robe suddenly discovered he had a son. As night fell, Elijah curled up on his temporary bed in his temporary room, surrounded by walls he'd never bothered to decorate. Tomorrow would bring more changes, more decisions made by adults who claimed to know what was best for him, but he knew better now. He'd learned his lessons well. Don't trust. Don't hope. Don't let anyone close enough to hurt you. The system had taught him that. 4 years of foster care had drilled these lessons into his soul, and no amount of fatherly remorse could change what he'd become. A child too old for his years, carrying scars that no one could see but everyone could feel. His mother's last words to him echoed in his memory. You'll always be loved, Elijah. But love, he'd learned, wasn't enough. Love didn't stop people from leaving. Love didn't keep promises. Love didn't protect you from the harsh realities of a world that had no place for unwanted children. As he drifted off to sleep, Elijah held on to his anger. It was safer than hope, more reliable than love, and the only thing he could truly call his own. 1 week after the courtroom revelation, Richard stood outside the Maplewood Children's Home, his heart pounding against his ribs. The building was well-maintained but institutional, all straight lines and neutral colors. A place meant to house children, not nurture them. Sarah Mitchell stood beside him, her expression carefully neutral. Remember what we discussed. Don't push too hard. Don't expect too much too soon. He's agreed to see you, but that's all he's agreed to. Richard nodded, adjusting his tie for the 10th time. He'd deliberately chosen not to wear a suit today. Just slacks and a casual button-down shirt. No reminders of the courtroom, no symbols of authority. Inside, a social worker led them to a small meeting room. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow, decorated with children's artwork, but nothing could hide the room's true purpose, a controlled environment for potentially difficult encounters. Elijah was already there, sitting at the table, his posture rigid. The photograph lay face down in front of him like a barrier between them. "Hello, Elijah," Richard said softly, taking the seat across from him. His hands itched to reach out, to touch his son, to somehow bridge the enormous gap between them, but he kept them folded in his lap. Elijah didn't respond, didn't look up. His small fingers traced the edges of the photograph. "I brought something for you," Richard continued, placing a carefully wrapped package on the table. "It's not much, but—" Elijah's eyes flickered to the package, then away. He made no move to take it. "It's okay if you don't want to open it now," Richard assured him. "It's yours whenever you're ready." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Richard fought the urge to fill it, remembering Sarah's advice. Sometimes silence was necessary, Sometimes silence was all a wounded heart could manage. Finally, Elijah spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're just another stranger." The words cut deep, but Richard kept his voice steady. "I know, and I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I'd like a chance to change that. You'll leave too." Elijah's fingers tightened on the photograph. "Everyone leaves." "Not this time," Richard promised. "I know you have no reason to believe me, but I'm not going anywhere." Elijah finally looked up, his eyes, so much like Naomi's, filled with a mixture of anger and pain. "Where were you when I needed you?" The question Richard had been dreading, the one he had no good answer for. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I know that doesn't make it right. I know that doesn't change what you've been through. But I swear to you, if I had known—" "You didn't look for us." Elijah cut him off. "Mom waited. She got sick and she waited and you never came." Richard's hands trembled. "My parents. They told me your mother had married someone else. They hid her letters, her calls. I believed them, and that was my mistake. I should have looked harder. I should have found you both." "Should have," Elijah echoed bitterly. "Should have doesn't fix anything." "No," Richard agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "It doesn't. Nothing can fix the past, but I'm here now, and I want to be part of your future. If you'll let me." Elijah's response was to slide the photograph across the table. It was the one from the courtroom, now carefully repaired with clear tape. She used to cry when she looked at this. Every night she'd hold it and cry. Richard picked up the photograph with trembling hands. The memory captured there felt like it belonged to another lifetime. He and Naomi, young and in love, unaware of the tragedy that awaited them. "I loved your mother very much," he said softly. "She was the best person I've ever known." "Then why didn't you fight for her?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with accusation. Richard closed his eyes, memories washing over him. "I was young," he admitted, "and weak. I let my parents control my life because it was easier than fighting them. I believed their lies because the truth, that Naomi had chosen to leave me, hurt too much to question. I failed you both, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life." When he opened his eyes again, Elijah was watching him intently, searching for something in his face. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Richard continued. "I'm not even asking you to like me. I'm just asking for a chance to be in your life, on whatever terms you're comfortable with." Elijah's response was unexpected. Miss Angela used to say that sometimes adults make mistakes because they're scared. Richard latched onto this small opening. "Miss Angela sounds very wise. Would you tell me about her?" For a moment, something softened in Elijah's expression. "She was nice. She read me stories, but then she got sick like Mom." The pain in his voice was unbearable. Richard wanted nothing more than to gather his son in his arms, to somehow protect him from all the loss he'd endured. But he remained still, respecting the invisible boundaries between them. "I'm so sorry you've lost so many people who cared about you," he said quietly. "I know it's hard to trust that anyone will stay. You're just here because you feel guilty," Elijah said, the walls coming back up. "You'll get tired of trying. Everyone does." "No," Richard's voice was firm. "I'm here because you're my son. Because I've missed 8 years of your life and I don't want to miss any more. The guilt, yes, I feel guilty, I should. But that's not why I'm here." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, removing a small, worn photograph. "I've carried this picture of your mother for 8 years. I never stopped loving her, even when I thought she'd chosen someone else. And now that I know about you, now that I've found you, I'm not going anywhere." Elijah's eyes fixed on the photograph, a different one from the one he carried. In this one, Naomi was laughing at something off camera, her face radiant with joy. Elijah hesitated. "Can I see it?" Richard handed it over carefully, watched as his son's fingers traced his mother's smile. "She used to laugh like that when she told me stories," Elijah said softly. "Before she got sick, Would you tell me one of her stories? Richard asked gently. I'd love to hear them. But the moment of openness had passed. Elijah handed the photograph back, retreating into silence. The rest of the visit passed quietly. Richard talked softly about neutral topics. The weather, the books on the room's shelves, simple things that required no response. When their time was up, he left the wrapped package on the table. It's yours, he reminded Elijah. Open it when you want to, or not at all. I'll be back tomorrow if that's okay. Elijah didn't respond, but he didn't say no either. Richard counted that as a tiny victory. Outside, Sarah was waiting. How did it go? He's hurting so much, Richard said, his voice breaking. How do I fix this? How do I help him trust again? One day at a time, Sarah replied. One tiny step at a time. That evening, Richard knelt beside his bed for the first time in years. God, he whispered. I failed my son. How do I fix this? The silence that answered was profound, but somehow comforting. The path ahead would be long and difficult, but at least now he knew which direction to walk. The next day, Richard returned. And the next. Each visit followed a similar pattern, mostly silence, occasional brief exchanges, always with the photograph between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. A week into these visits, Richard arrived to find Elijah holding the still-wrapped package. You can open it, Richard encouraged gently. It's just something I thought you might like. Slowly, carefully, Elijah unwrapped the package. Inside was a wooden frame, expertly crafted to hold two photographs side by side. On one side was a perfectly restored version of Elijah's torn photograph. On the other, space waited for a new picture, a future memory yet to be made. I had your photograph professionally restored, Richard explained. The original is still yours, but I thought, maybe someday we could fill the other side, together. Elijah stared at the frame for a long moment, his fingers tracing the empty space. Why now? He asked suddenly. Why do you care now? I've always cared, Richard answered honestly. I just didn't know who to care about. But now I do, and I'm not going to waste another day not being your father. That's when the dam broke. All the pain, all the anger that Elijah had been holding. Back came flooding out. You weren't there, he shouted, standing so abruptly his chair fell backward. You weren't there when Mom died. You weren't there when they put me in houses with people who hurt me. You weren't there when I needed you. You're right, Richard acknowledged, his own voice thick with tears. I wasn't there, and I will regret that every day for the rest of my life. I hate you, Elijah sobbed, but the words held more pain than anger. I hate you for not being there. I know, Richard whispered. You have every right to hate me. But I love you, Elijah. I love you. And I'm here now. And I'm not going anywhere. For the first time since they'd begun these visits, Elijah's control cracked completely. He crumpled to the floor, great heaving, sobs racking his small frame. Richard moved without thinking, crossing the space between them, gathering his son in his arms. For a moment Elijah stiffened, then collapsed against him, crying out 8 years of loss and pain and loneliness. I've got you, Richard murmured, his own tears falling. I've got you now, son. I'm here. They stayed like that until Elijah's sobs quieted. When he finally pulled away, something had shifted between them. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of it. Later that day, Richard faced another battle. His parents had arrived at his home, uninvited and unwelcome. Be reasonable. Richard, his father began. This situation can be handled quietly. The boy can be well provided for without disrupting your life. Get out. Richard's voice was deadly quiet. You stole my son from me. You stole my life from him. Get out of my house and don't ever come back. Now, darling, his mother tried. Everything we did was for your own good. My own good? Richard laughed bitterly. You destroyed the woman I loved. You left my son to suffer in foster care. There's nothing good about what you did. We'll cut you off, his father threatened. Everything you have, I don't want anything from you, Richard interrupted. Not your money, not your connections, not your toxic version of love. Get out. Now. After they left, Richard sat in his study, looking at the photograph of Naomi. I'll make this right, he promised her. Whatever it takes, I'll make this right. The next day, he went public. In front of the judge handling Elijah's case, in front of social workers and court officials, he laid bare the whole story. His parents' deception, his own failure to fight harder, his absolute commitment to making things right. I know I haven't earned the right to be his father, he concluded, but I'm asking for the chance to try. That evening he visited Elijah again. The boy was quieter than usual, subdued after the previous day's emotional outbreak. I brought something else for you, Richard said softly, placing a small box on the table. Inside was a simple silver chain with a pendant, a compass. So you'll always know you can find your way home, Richard explained. Even if you're not ready for that home to be with me yet. Elijah picked up the compass, turning it over in his hands. Why don't you give up? He asked quietly. Everyone else does. Because you're my son, Richard answered simply. And I love you. Nothing will ever change that. That night, alone in his temporary room, Elijah held the compass in one hand and the photograph in the other. Why do I want to believe him? He whispered to his mother's smiling face. Why do I want to trust him? The photograph, as always, held no answers. But perhaps, somewhere in his heart, hope had begun to stir again, fragile as a butterfly's wing, but present nonetheless. And in his own home, Richard added a new photograph to his wallet, a court document with Elijah's name on it, a reminder of what he'd lost, what he'd found, and what he was fighting to rebuild. The path ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time since that day in court, both father and son had taken a step forward. Not together, not yet, but in the same direction. The headline splashed across the morning paper hit like a physical blow. Respected judge abandons son to foster care. Full story inside. Richard stared at the words, his coffee growing cold beside him. The media had caught wind of the story, just as Judge Harrison had warned they would. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Colleagues, reporters, even old friends, everyone, wanted a statement, an explanation, a piece of the scandal. But Richard's only concern was how this would affect Elijah. Sarah Mitchell's call came just after 9. Have you seen the papers? Hard to miss, Richard replied, his voice tight. How's Elijah? Withdrawn. More than usual. Some reporters tried to get onto the children's home property this morning. Security turned them away, but... She paused. The hearing is this afternoon. Your father's lawyer filed a motion to block your custody petition. Richard's grip tightened on the phone. On what grounds? They're claiming emotional instability, citing the courtroom incident as evidence of poor judgment. Richard, they're bringing up every case you've ever presided over involving parental rights, trying to use your own rulings against you. The irony wasn't lost on him. How many times had he sat in judgment of other parents, never knowing he'd abandoned his own child? What time is the hearing? 2 o'clock. Judge Harrison wants to speak with Elijah first, privately. Richard closed his eyes, remembering his last visit with Elijah. The boy had been more withdrawn than usual, the weight of public attention clearly affecting him. The courthouse felt different now. Walking through the familiar halls as a father fighting for his son rather than a judge dispensing justice changed everything. Whispers followed him, colleagues averting their eyes or offering awkward nods of acknowledgement. Judge Harrison's courtroom was smaller than his had been, more intimate. His father sat in the front row, ramrod straight in an expensive suit. Elizabeth. Caldwell was notably absent, probably couldn't bear the scandal, Richard thought bitterly. James Caldwell's lawyer, Thomas Bradford, approached before the hearing began. There's still time to handle this quietly, he offered in a low voice. Your father is willing to be generous, a trust fund for the boy, the best private schools. His name is Elijah, Richard cut him off. "And he's not for sale." The hearing began with Elijah's testimony. The boy entered through the judge's chambers, avoiding looking at anyone. His social worker, Ms. Roberts, sat beside him, a protective hand on his shoulder. "Elijah," Judge Harrison began gently, "I know this is difficult, but I need to hear from you. How do you feel about Mr. Caldwell seeking custody?" Elijah's voice was small but clear. "He left us. He says he didn't know, but he left. And now that he knows about you, how has he been?" Elijah's fingers found the compass pendant Richard had given him, though Richard doubted he was even aware of the gesture. "He keeps coming back, even when I don't talk, even when I'm angry." "Dow. You want him to keep coming back?" The silence stretched for several heartbeats. "I don't know." Bradford stood. "Your Honor, the child's ambivalence clearly indicates—" "The child has a name," Richard interrupted, unable to stay silent. "His name is Elijah, and he has every right to be ambivalent. I wasn't there for 8 years. He's been hurt, betrayed, moved from home to home. Trust isn't something that comes back overnight." Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Bradford, please continue." The attorney launched into his prepared argument. Richard's emotional outburst in court, his resignation from the bench, his impulsive pursuit of custody, all presented as evidence of instability. Furthermore, Bradford continued, Mr. Caldwell's own rulings in similar cases demonstrate the high standards he himself set for parental fitness, standards he clearly cannot meet in his current emotional state. Richard's lawyer began to object, but another voice cut through the courtroom. "You don't know anything about him." Every head turned. Elijah had stood up, his small frame trembling, but his voice stronger than Richard had ever heard it. "You don't know how he sits with me even when I won't talk. You don't know how he fixed my mom's picture when it got torn. You don't know anything!" The outburst left the courtroom in stunned silence. Judge Harrison leaned forward. "Elijah, would you like to say more?" Tears streamed down the boy's face now. "Everyone leaves. Everyone gives up. He hasn't given up." Richard's heart clenched. He wanted nothing more than to go to his son, to hold him, to promise again that he would never leave. But he remained in his seat, respecting the court's procedures. Bradford recovered quickly. "Your Honor, this emotional display only proves our point about the unstable environment." "Enough." James Caldwell's voice cut through his lawyer's argument. He stood slowly, his face ashen. "That's enough, Thomas." Richard watched in disbelief as his father approached the bench. "Your Honor, I wish to withdraw our opposition to my son's custody petition." "Dad?" Richard couldn't keep the shock from his voice. James Caldwell turned to face his son, looking suddenly old and tired. "I thought I was protecting you. All these years I thought I knew what was best. But looking at that boy, your son, I see now what we stole from both of you." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. "These are copies of every letter Naomi wrote. We kept them all. I thought someday you might want them, to understand." He placed them on the table in front of Richard. "I'm sorry, son. I was wrong." The admission hung in the air, decades of control and manipulation crumbling in the face of one child's raw pain. Judge Harrison called a recess to review the new developments. In the hallway, Richard found himself face to face with his father. "Why, now?" he asked quietly. James Caldwell looked at his grandson, who stood with his social worker across the hall. "Because he fights for you. Even hurt, even angry. He fights for you. Just like you're fighting for him. I was too blind to see it before, but he's a Caldwell through and through." "No," Richard shook his head. "He's his mother's son. He has her heart, her strength. I'm just lucky enough to have a chance to know him." When court resumed, Judge Harrison's decision was measured, but clear. Richard would be granted provisional custody, with regular check-ins from social services. A transition period would be established, allowing Elijah time to adjust to each new step. "This won't be easy," she warned them both. "There's a lot of hurt to heal, a lot of trust to rebuild, but I believe it's worth trying. After the hearing, Richard found Elijah sitting alone in the conference room, staring at the pile of his mother's letters. "We don't have to read them now," Richard said softly. "Or ever, if you don't want to. They're yours to decide about." Elijah picked up the top letter, his fingers tracing his mother's handwriting. "She never stopped writing to you." "No, she didn't. Your mother was the strongest person I've ever known. She never gave up hope." "Did you?" Elijah's voice was barely a whisper. "Give up hope?" Richard sat down beside him, careful to maintain a small distance. "I gave up too easily. I believed lies because the truth would have hurt too much. That's not an excuse, it's just the truth. I failed you both. What happens now? Now we take it one day at a time. You'll stay at Maplewood until you're comfortable with the idea of coming home with me. We'll keep having our visits. Nothing happens until you're ready." Elijah's hand went to the compass pendant again. "What if I'm never ready?" "Then we keep trying. I meant what I said. I'm not giving up. Not ever again." Later that evening, at home, Richard finally opened the letters. Naomi's words, preserved in her elegant handwriting, told the story of their son's early years. Her joy at his first steps, her pride in his gentle heart, her unwavering faith that someday Richard would find his way back to them. The last letter, written from her hospital bed, broke his heart anew. "My dearest Richard, the doctors say I don't have much time left. Our son asks for stories about you every night. I tell him how kind you were, how much you would have loved him if you'd known. Please, if you ever read this, find him. Love him enough for both of us. He has your eyes and my heart, and he deserves all the love this world can give him. Forever yours, Naomi." Richard wept then, for all the years lost, for Naomi's unfailing love, for the little boy who had suffered so much because of lies and pride. The next morning brought more headlines. Judge fights for custody of abandoned son. Family drama unfolds. But this time Richard was ready. He agreed to one interview, choosing a respected journalist known for her integrity. In the interview, he held nothing back. He admitted his failures, acknowledged his parents' deception without using it as an excuse, and spoke honestly about his determination to rebuild a relationship with his son. "I can't change the past," he told the reporter. "I can't undo the hurt my absence caused. But I can be here now, every day, proving to my son that he deserves to be loved, deserves to be fought for, deserves to have a father who will never give up on him." The story ran the next day, and something shifted in the public narrative. Comments on online articles began to change from condemnation to cautious support. Other parents came forward with stories of family estrangement and reconciliation. But Richard paid little attention to the media circus. His focus remained solely on Elijah. Their next visit was different. Elijah brought one of Naomi's letters, one describing his first day of preschool. "Would you?" He hesitated. "Would you read it with me?" They read together, Richard's voice thick with emotion as Naomi's words painted a picture of their son's early life. When they finished, Elijah was quiet for a long moment. "She never said anything bad about you," he finally said. "Even when she was really sick. She just said you were lost." "Your mother had the kindest heart of anyone I've ever known," Richard replied softly. "I didn't deserve her forgiveness." "Do you?" Elijah swallowed hard. "Do you think she'd want me to forgive you too?" Richard felt tears prick at his eyes. "I think your mother would want whatever brings you peace, Elijah. Don't forgive me for her sake or for mine. Only if and when it feels right to you." Elijah nodded, clutching the letter. "Can we read another one tomorrow?" "As many as you want, son. I'll be here." And he was. Every day Richard showed up. Through Elijah's silence, through his anger, through the slow, painful process of building trust. Each small step forward felt like a victory, each setback a reminder of how far they had to go. The media, attention gradually faded. James Caldwell made no further attempts to interfere, though he did set up a trust fund for Elijah, not as a bribe, but as a grandfather's attempt at making amends. Elizabeth Caldwell sent a letter, full of justifications and excuses. Richard returned it unopened. Some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. 1 month after the hearing, Elijah agreed to visit Richard's house for the first time. He walked through each room slowly, taking everything in, his hand never leaving the compass pendant around his neck. In what would be his room when he was ready, Richard had created a memory wall, copies of photos from Naomi's letters, the restored picture in its double frame, space waiting for new memories to be made. Elijah stood before it for a long time, saying nothing. But when they left, he asked, "Can we come back tomorrow?" "Whenever you want," Richard promised. "This is your home too whenever you're ready for it to be." That night, as Richard sat in his study, he looked at the photograph of Naomi that had started everything. "I'm trying," he whispered to her smiling face. "I'm trying to be the father he deserves, the man you always believed I could be." The path ahead was still long and uncertain. Trust, once broken, took time to rebuild. But for the first time since that day in court, both father and son could see a future where healing was possible. Not easy, not guaranteed, but possible. And, for now, that possibility was enough to keep them both moving forward, one day at a time. The manila envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning. Richard's hands trembled as he read the law firm's letterhead, Johnson & Associates, the firm that had handled Naomi's estate. Inside were letters, dozens of them, each sealed and dated but never sent. "We recently discovered these while digitizing. Old files," the accompanying note explained. "Ms. Carter left them in our possession, hoping they would somehow reach you." Richard sank into his office chair, the weight of unopened words pressing against his heart. Each envelope held pieces of a life he should have shared, moments he could never get back. The earliest was dated just after their separation, the last only weeks before Naomi's death. As he read, tears flowed freely. Naomi's voice, preserved, in her elegant handwriting, painted vivid pictures of their son's early years. "Elijah took his first steps today. He was reaching for your picture on the nightstand. Sometimes I think he knows you, even though he's never met you. He has your determined look when he's trying something new." His first word was, "book." You would love how much he enjoys stories. "Remember how we used to talk about reading to our children someday? He's just like we imagined." "The doctors say the cancer is spreading. I'm trying to be brave for Elijah, but I'm so scared, Richard. Not of dying, but of leaving our son alone. He deserves so much more than this broken world has given him." A knock at his office door startled him from his reading. Sarah Mitchell entered, her expression concerned. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, taking in his tear-stained face. "In a way, I have." Richard gestured to the letters spread across his desk. "Naomi's lawyer found these. She never stopped writing to me, Sarah. Even when she was dying, she never stopped believing I'd come back." Sarah picked up one of the letters, scanning it quickly. "Have you shown these to Elijah?" "Not yet. I don't want to overwhelm him. We've been making progress with the other letters, but these..." He ran a hand through his hair. "These are different, more personal, more raw. He deserves to know how much she fought for both of you," Sarah said gently. Richard nodded. "I know, I need to find the right way." The opportunity came sooner than expected. That afternoon, during their scheduled visit, Elijah was unusually quiet. He kept looking at Richard when he thought his father wasn't watching, his expression troubled. "What's on your mind, son?" Richard asked softly. Elijah hesitated, then spoke in a rush. "My social worker said you're going to court again next week, about keeping me." "That's right, but only if you're comfortable with it. Nothing happens until you're ready. What if..." Elijah swallowed hard. "What if you change your mind? What if you decide I'm too much trouble?" The fear in his voice broke Richard's heart. "Elijah, look at me." He waited until their eyes met. "You are my son. You could never be too much trouble. I love you, and that's not going to change." "But how do you know?" Elijah's voice cracked. "You didn't even want me before." "That's not true." Richard reached for the manila envelope he'd brought with him. "I need to show you something." He pulled out one of Naomi's letters, dated just after Elijah's birth. "Your mother wrote this the day you were born. She never sent it, but she kept writing, hoping someday I'd read her words." Elijah took the letter with trembling hands. As he read, tears filled his eyes. "She really tried to tell you about me? She never stopped trying. Look." Richard spread more letters across the table. "Every important moment, every milestone, she wrote them all down for me. She never wanted me to miss a single piece of your life." Elijah picked up another letter, then another. His mother's words surrounded him, telling the story of his early years through her eyes, her pride in his achievements, her joy in his personality, her unwavering faith that someday his father would be part of his life. "I remember this," he said suddenly, holding up a letter. "The day I learned to ride a bike, she was so happy. She said," his voice caught, "she said you would have been proud." "I am proud," Richard said softly. "I'm proud of everything you are, Elijah. I'm just sorry I wasn't there to see it all." For the first time since they'd begun these visits, Elijah didn't pull away when Richard moved closer. Instead, he leaned slightly toward his father, allowing their shoulders to touch as they read more letters together. "She never got mad at you," Elijah observed, his voice wondering. "Even when she was really sick, she just kept hoping. Your mother had the most generous heart of anyone I've ever known. She saw the best in everyone, even when we didn't deserve it." Elijah was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he asked the question Richard had been dreading. "Did you ever think about us, even when you didn't know about me?" Richard's answer was honest. "Every day. I thought about your mother every single day. I kept her picture, remembered every moment we shared. I believed the lies I was told because the truth, that she might have needed me and I wasn't there, was too painful to face." Something shifted in Elijah's expression. For the first time, he seemed to see his father's pain as separate from his own, not competing with it but existing alongside it. "I have all her other letters at home," Richard continued softly. "The ones your grandfather kept from me. They're yours whenever you want to read them." "At your house?" Elijah's voice was uncertain. "Your house too, when you're ready for it to be. No pressure, no rush. Just, it's there whenever you want it." They spent the rest of the visit reading more letters. Elijah asked questions about the memories Naomi described, filling in gaps in Richard's knowledge of his early years. For the first time, their conversation flowed naturally, without the usual walls between them. As their time drew to a close, Elijah gathered the letters carefully. Can I keep these ones?" "Of course. They're yours. All of them are yours." That night, Richard received an unexpected call from Ms. Roberts, Elijah's social worker. "He asked to call you," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "He's never asked to call anyone before." Richard's heart leaped as Elijah's voice came on the line, small but clear. "I read more of Mom's letters." "Yeah? Which ones?" "The one about my first day of school," she said. He paused. "She said you would have walked me to class if you'd been there." "I would have," Richard confirmed, his throat tight. "I would have been so nervous watching you go into that classroom." "Really? Really? Just like I'm nervous now, hoping you'll give me a chance to be part of your life. But it's a good kind of nervous, the kind that means something really matters to you." Elijah was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can we read more letters tomorrow?" "Absolutely. I'll bring them all." The next day's visit was different. The usual tension was still there, but underneath it ran a current of something new. Not quite trust, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Elijah brought his mother's photo album, sharing stories about the pictures inside. Richard listened, treasuring each glimpse into the years he'd missed, each small detail about the woman he'd loved and the son he was just beginning to know. When the social worker came to end their visit, Elijah did something unprecedented. He hesitated before leaving. "Could we?" he started. then stopped, gathering courage. "Could we maybe read letters at your house next time? Just for a little while?" Richard had to work to keep his voice steady. "Of course. Whenever you want." That weekend, Elijah spent 2 hours in Richard's study, surrounded by Naomi's letters and photographs. He moved cautiously through the house, taking in everything but always staying close to Richard, as if afraid to let him out of sight. In what would be Elijah's room, they sat together on the window seat, reading letters and sharing quiet memories. The silence between them was comfortable now, not heavy with unspoken pain. "Mom was right about you," Elijah said suddenly. "What do you mean?" "In her letters, she said you were someone who didn't give up when things were hard. She said you'd find your way back if you knew about me." He touched the compass pendant he still wore. She was right. Richard couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. Instead, he simply opened another letter, letting Naomi's words bridge the gap between them. As the day drew to a close, Elijah stood in the doorway of his future room, looking at the memory wall Richard had created. "Could we?" He hesitated. "Could we maybe put some of Mom's letters up there too? We can put anything you want up there, it's your space." Elijah nodded, then asked the question that had clearly been weighing on him. "What if I want to stay? Not now, but someday?" "Then this room will be waiting for you, for as long as it takes." That night, after Elijah returned to the children's home, Richard sat in his study looking at the photograph that had started everything. "He's starting to trust," he whispered to Naomi's smiling face. "Not completely, not yet. But he's trying. Thank you for never giving up on me. On us. Thank you for giving me a chance to know our son." The next week brought more changes. Elijah began asking questions about Richard's life, showing curiosity about the man behind the father he never knew. "Were you really a judge?" "Yes, but that's not important anymore. Being your father is what matters now." "Did you always want to be a judge?" "Actually, when I was your age, I wanted to be a superhero." That earned him the first genuine laugh he'd heard from his son, a sound so precious it brought tears to his eyes. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. During one of their reading sessions, Elijah found a letter describing a particularly difficult time, when Naomi had first gotten sick. "I was so scared," he whispered. "She tried to hide it, but I knew something was wrong. I used to pretend you would come and fix everything." The words tumbled out now, years of pent-up pain finding release. "Why did you have to come back now?" "Why not then, when we needed you? Why did you let her die alone?" Richard didn't try to defend himself. Instead, he opened his arms, offering comfort without demanding acceptance. To his surprise and joy, Elijah fell into the embrace, sobbing out 8 years of loss and grief and anger. "I'm so sorry," Richard murmured, his own tears falling. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there. I can't change the past, but I'm here now. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." They stayed like that for a long time, father and son, letting tears wash away some of the pain between them. When Elijah finally pulled back, his eyes were red but clearer. "I want to try," he said quietly. "I want to try having a dad." Richard's heart soared, but he kept his voice calm. "We'll take it slow, one day at a time, whatever pace feels right to you." That evening, Elijah did something that changed everything. He placed Naomi's photograph on his bedside table at Richard's house, next to the new frame that still waited for future memories. It was a small gesture, but its meaning was clear. He was ready to start building something new, even while holding on to the precious memories of the past. The walls weren't completely down. Years of trauma and trust issues couldn't be erased by a few weeks of progress, but they had cracked enough to let hope shine through. And sometimes hope was enough to build a future on. Moving day arrived with little fanfare. Elijah's belongings fit into 2 small boxes and a backpack, a testament to the transient life he'd been forced to live. Richard carried them into what was now officially Elijah's room, watching as his son stood in the doorway, clutching his mother's photograph like a shield. "We can arrange everything however you want," Richard said softly. This is your space. Elijah nodded but didn't move. After spending so long in temporary homes, the concept of permanence felt foreign, almost dangerous to believe in. Should we unpack? Richard suggested, keeping his voice casual. Or would you rather take some time to get used to the room first? Can we? Elijah's voice was barely a whisper. Can we leave the boxes for now? Richard understood. Unpacking meant accepting this was real, that he was staying. It meant trusting that this home wouldn't disappear like all the others. Of course, there's no rush. How about we get some lunch instead? In the kitchen, Richard moved carefully, trying not to overwhelm his son with too much attention. He'd spent weeks learning Elijah's favorite foods from his social worker, but today he kept things simple: grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, comfort food for an uncomfortable transition. As he placed the plates on the table, a memory struck him. Your mother used to make this for me when I was studying for law school exams. Elijah looked up sharply. Really? She said comfort food was essential for stressful times. Richard smiled at the memory. She'd add little extras, special spices, in the soup, different cheeses in the sandwich. Said it was her secret recipe for success. She made it for me too, Elijah said quietly. When I was sick or after bad days at school, they ate in companionable silence, each lost in memories of the woman who had loved them both. When they finished, Elijah helped clear the dishes without being asked, a habit born from years of trying to be the perfect foster child, Richard realized with a pang. You don't have to earn your place here, he said gently. This is your home now. Elijah stared at the plate in his hands. What if I mess up? Then we'll fix it together. Everyone messes up sometimes, Elijah. It doesn't change anything about how much I love you. The plate trembled slightly. The Wilsons said that too, at first. Richard's heart clenched. Carefully, he took the plate and set it down. I'm not the Wilsons, or any of the others. I'm your father, and nothing will make me send you away. That first evening was an exercise in careful navigation. Richard wanted desperately to make everything perfect, to somehow compensate for 8 years of absence. But he forced himself to give Elijah space, to let him set the pace. When bedtime came, the true challenge began. Elijah stood in his new room, eyeing the bed like it might bite him. Richard had learned about his nightmares from the social worker, night terrors that left him shaking and silent. Would it help if I sat with you for a while? Elijah shook his head quickly. Too quickly. I'm fine. Okay. But if you need anything at all, I'm just down the hall. You can come get me anytime. Even in the middle of the night? Even then. Especially then. Richard left the door cracked open, a nightlight casting soft shadows on the wall. He lay awake in his own room, listening. Around 2 in the morning he heard it. The soft sounds of distress from down the hall. He found Elijah huddled in the corner, tears streaming silently down his face. Without a word, Richard sat down beside him, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to crowd him. Bad dream? A tiny nod. Want to talk about it? A shake of the head. That's okay. We can just sit here together. They stayed like that until Elijah's breathing steadied. When he finally spoke, his voice was small but steady. I dreamed you sent me away. Like the others. Never going to happen, Richard promised. You're stuck with me, kid. A ghost of a smile touched Elijah's lips. Promise? Promise. The next morning brought new challenges. Richard had arranged to work from home for the first few weeks, but Elijah still had to attend school. The prospect clearly terrified him. What if they asked questions, he worried, picking at his breakfast. About everything? Then you tell them whatever you're comfortable sharing, or nothing at all. It's your story, Elijah. You get to decide who knows it. The drive to school was tense. As they pulled up to the building, Richard noticed Elijah's hand go to the compass pendant he still wore. Want me to walk you in? I'm not a baby, Elijah protested, but his relief was obvious when Richard got out of the car anyway. Inside, they met with Elijah's teacher, Mrs. Bennett. She started to reference his situation, but Richard cut her off with a look. "Elijah is my son," he said firmly. "That's all anyone needs to know." But the day didn't go as smoothly as hoped. By lunch, word had spread about Elijah's story. Apparently, some parents had seen the news coverage and discussed it with their children. "Hey, foster kid," a boy called across the cafeteria. "Is it true your dad didn't want you?" Before Elijah could react, Richard's voice cut through the chatter. He'd come to deliver the lunch Elijah had forgotten in the car, just in time to hear the taunt. "Actually," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I want my son very much, and I don't appreciate anyone suggesting otherwise." The cafeteria fell silent. Richard walked over to Elijah's table, set down the lunch bag, and squeezed his shoulder gently. "You okay?" Elijah nodded, something like pride flickering in his eyes. For the first time, he'd seen his father defend him publicly, unequivocally. That afternoon, they had their first real test. Richard was on a work call when he heard a crash from the kitchen. He found Elijah frozen in place, a broken glass at his feet, terror written across his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Please don't." "Hey," Richard interrupted gently. "It's just a glass. Are you hurt?" Elijah shook his head, still rigid with fear. "Then that's all that matters. Let's clean this up together, okay?" As they swept up the broken pieces, Richard noticed Elijah's hands were shaking. "Want to talk about it?" "The Wilsons," Elijah swallowed hard. "When I broke things, they'd lock me in the closet. Said I had to learn to be more careful with other people's things." Richard's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "This is your home too, Elijah. These things belong to both of us, and more importantly, you matter more than any object ever could." That evening, Richard cooked dinner, or tried to. He'd never been much of a chef, and the chicken came out slightly burned. "Mom used to say you couldn't boil water," Elijah observed, poking at his blackened piece with a fork. Richard laughed. "She wasn't wrong. Want to order pizza instead?" They ended up on the couch with pizza and sodas, watching a movie Elijah picked out. Halfway through, Richard noticed his son had fallen asleep, his head drooping against the armrest. Carefully, he carried Elijah to bed. As he tucked him in, a small hand caught his sleeve. "Stay?" The word was barely audible. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, holding his son's hand until sleep claimed him again. The days fell into a pattern. Mornings were quiet, both of them learning each other's rhythms. Richard discovered Elijah liked his toast barely browned and hated the crusts. Just like his mother had, Elijah learned that his father couldn't function without at least 2 cups of coffee. Small victories came in unexpected moments. The day Elijah finally unpacked his boxes, the first time he called out "Dad" without hesitation. The morning Richard found him making breakfast, burning the toast but trying so hard to do something nice for his father. But there were setbacks too. The night Elijah had a meltdown, screaming that Richard was a liar, that he'd leave just like everyone else. Instead of arguing, Richard simply said, "I love you and I'm not going anywhere." The words became their anchor, repeated through tears and tantrums and quiet moments of doubt. One particularly difficult evening, Richard found Elijah in his room, the old photograph of his parents on his lap. "Do you think she'd be mad at me?" he asked quietly. "Who? Your mother. Why would she be mad?" For starting to love you. For wanting this to work." Richard sat beside him, choosing his words carefully. "Your mother loved you more than anything in this world. All she ever wanted was for you to be happy and loved. I think she'd be overjoyed to see us finding our way to each other." Elijah was quiet for a long moment. Then, with trembling hands, he took the photograph and walked to the memory wall. Carefully, he placed it next to a new picture, one of him and Richard at the park last weekend. "I want to keep both," he said softly. "Is that okay?" "More than okay," Richard assured him, his voice thick with emotion. "It's perfect." The weeks brought more changes. Richard's parents tried to reconnect, sending letters full of justifications and excuses. "They want to meet you," Richard told Elijah. But only if you want to. There's no pressure. Did they really keep Mom's letters from you? Yes. Then I don't want to meet them. Not yet. Okay. That's completely your choice. The hardest moments were when Elijah talked about his mother's illness, about watching her fade away, about being powerless to help. I prayed every night, he confessed one evening. I asked God to make her better, to send you to help us. But you never came. I wish I had, Richard said, his voice raw with regret. I wish I'd known. I wish I'd looked harder, fought harder to find you both. I know, Elijah said quietly. I think I'm starting to believe you. That night, Richard passed Elijah's room and heard him praying. God, I don't know if I can forgive him yet, but if Mom was right about him, I hope she'll tell me somehow. Richard leaned against the wall, tears streaming down his face. The path to healing was long and winding, but they were walking it together, one step at a time. Months passed. The memory wall filled with new photographs, Elijah's first soccer game, a trip to the zoo, ordinary moments that became extraordinary because they were shared. Some days were harder than others. The anniversary of Naomi's death brought old grief surging back. But this time, Elijah didn't face it alone. They visited her grave together, placing fresh flowers and the latest school picture. I wish she could see us, Elijah whispered. She can, Richard assured him. And I bet she's smiling. That evening, as Richard tucked Elijah into bed, a ritual that had become precious to them both, his son said something that made his heart soar. Dad? Yeah? I'm glad you found me. Even if it took a long time. Me too, son. Me too. The healing wasn't complete, might never be complete. But they were family now, bound by love and choice and the determination to make up for lost time. And somewhere, Richard liked to think, Naomi was watching over them, both. Her heart full of the joy she'd always believed was possible. The courtroom where everything began looked different now. 6 months had passed since that fateful day, and today they were here for a different purpose, to finalize Richard's adoption of Elijah. Though technically his biological father, the legal adoption would erase any questions about custody and rights, making their family officially complete in the eyes of the law. Judge Harrison smiled as she reviewed the paperwork. Elijah sat beside Richard, no longer the hollow-eyed child who had first confronted his father in this very building. He wore a new suit, his choice, wanting to dress up for what he called their real family day. The court has reviewed all documentation, Judge Harrison announced. Mr. Caldwell, your commitment to your son's well-being has been thoroughly demonstrated over these past months. Elijah, do you understand what today means? Elijah's voice was clear and strong, so different from the angry whispers of 6 months ago. Yes, Your Honor. It means Dad is officially my dad. Forever. Richard squeezed his son's hand, fighting back tears. Very well. Judge Harrison's smile widened. Then, by the power vested in me, I hereby grant this adoption. Congratulations, you are now, in every legal sense, father and son. The small group of witnesses, Sarah Mitchell, Ms. Roberts, and a few close friends, broke into applause. Elijah turned to Richard, his face beaming. We did it, Dad. Richard pulled him into a tight hug, not caring about the tears now flowing freely. We sure did, buddy. We sure did. After the ceremony, they drove to their next destination, Naomi's grave. It had become their tradition to share important moments with her, keeping her memory alive in their new life together. The spring sunshine warmed the quiet cemetery as they approached her headstone. Richard carried a bouquet of her favorite flowers, yellow daisies, while Elijah clutched the adoption certificate. Hi, Mom, Elijah said softly, placing his hand on the cool stone. We did it. Dad and I are officially a family now. I mean, we were already, but now everybody knows it. Richard knelt beside him. We brought you flowers, Naomi, and good news. Our boy's doing amazing in school. Straight A's this semester. You'd be so proud of him. She'd be proud of you too, Dad, Elijah said quietly, for finding your way back to us. They stayed for a while, sharing stories and memories. Elijah told his mother about his recent soccer game, where Richard had cheered so loudly he'd embarrassed them both. Richard spoke about Elijah's growing interest in law, how he'd started asking questions about different cases, showing the same passion for justice that had once driven his father. On their way home, Richard had a surprise planned. "One more. Stop," he said, turning down a familiar street. Elijah's eyes widened as they pulled up to their favorite ice cream parlor. "Dad, is this the place where I first met your mother?" "Yes." Richard smiled at the memory. "She worked here during college. I used to come in every day just to see her smile." Inside, Richard led them to a specific booth. "Right here. This is where I finally got up the courage to ask her out." "What did she say?" Elijah asked, though he'd heard the story before. "She said, 'It's about time. I was running out of reasons to give you free samples.'" They ordered their usual chocolate chip mint for Richard, strawberry swirl for Elijah, just like Naomi used to get. "Dad?" Elijah's voice was thoughtful as he stirred his ice cream. "Can we do something special for my birthday next week?" Richard's heart swelled. It would be their first birthday celebration together. "Anything you want, buddy? Could we make Mom's special breakfast? The one she wrote about in her letters? With the heart-shaped pancakes and everything?" "Absolutely." Richard pretended to consider. "Though you might want to have a backup plan given my cooking skills." Elijah laughed, a free, unguarded sound that still felt like a miracle every time Richard heard it. "We can practice. Maybe we'll get it right by my 20th birthday." The morning of Elijah's 9th birthday dawned bright and clear. Richard had been up since dawn, determined to make Naomi's special breakfast perfect. The kitchen looked like a flower bomb had exploded, but finally, he managed to create something resembling heart-shaped pancakes. "Dad?" Elijah's sleepy voice came from the doorway. "What's that smell?" "That, son, is the smell of victory. Or possibly defeat. We'll find out when we taste them." To his surprise, the pancakes were actually edible. As they ate, Richard presented Elijah with a small, carefully wrapped package. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with Elijah's name. "Your mother kept journals," Richard explained. "She wrote about everything. Her hopes, her dreams, her love for you. I thought maybe you'd like to start your own." Elijah ran his fingers over the smooth leather. Could we read some of Mom's journals sometime?" "Of course. Whenever you're ready." The party later that day was small, just a few friends from school, plus Sarah and Ms. Roberts, who had become like family. As Elijah blew out his candles, Richard caught him smiling, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "What did you wish for?" one of his friends asked. Elijah glanced at Richard. "Nothing. I already have what I wanted." That evening, as Richard tucked him in, a ritual neither of them was ready to give up, Elijah had a question. "Dad, do you think Mom knows we're okay now?" Richard sat on the edge of the bed considering. "I think she knows. I think she's been watching over us this whole time, helping us find our way to each other." "Like a compass," Elijah said, touching the pendant he still wore. "Exactly like a compass." The next morning, Richard found Elijah in the kitchen, attempting to make breakfast. The sight of his son, confidently moving around what he now considered his kitchen, brought tears to his eyes. "Need help?" "Nope." Elijah grinned. "I've been practicing with YouTube videos. Someone has to learn to cook in this family." As they ate the slightly burnt but perfectly made with love toast, Elijah brought up something unexpected. "I've been thinking about Grandma and Grandpa." Richard carefully set down his coffee. "Oh? Maybe we could meet them. Not right away, but someday. Mom's letters said everybody deserves a second chance if they're really sorry. Only, if you're absolutely sure," Richard said carefully. "There's no pressure." "I know, but they're trying. Like you tried with me." The wisdom in those words, so like something Naomi would say, struck Richard deeply. Later that week, they took their regular walk through the park. It had become their tradition. Every Sunday, weather permitting, they'd walk and talk about anything and everything. "Tell me more about when you and Mom met," Elijah requested. Richard smiled, launching into the familiar story. But this time, Elijah added his own memories, creating a fuller picture of the woman they both loved. "She used to sing this silly song when she made dinner," Elijah remembered, "and dance around the kitchen." "The cooking song," Richard laughed. "I'd forgotten about that. She claimed it made the food taste better." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, then Elijah spoke again. "Dad, I'm ready to move the photo." Richard knew immediately which photo he meant, the one of Naomi that had started everything, the one Elijah had carried through years of foster homes. "Are you sure?" Elijah nodded. "It belongs in the family album now, with all our new pictures." That evening, they sat together with the family album. Carefully, Elijah placed the photograph in its new home, right next to their most recent family picture. The two of them at his birthday party, both laughing at some shared joke. "Perfect," Richard said softly. "Mom told me something once," Elijah said, tracing the edge of the photograph. "She said love doesn't disappear. It just gets lost sometimes. I think I understand what she meant now." Richard pulled his son close. "Your mother was the wisest person I've ever known." She also said, "You were stubborn as a mule, but that's why she loved you." Richard laughed. She wasn't wrong about that either. As they continued looking through the album, Elijah shared more memories of Naomi, little things he'd been too hurt to talk about before. How she'd make up stories about constellations on clear nights, how she'd leave little notes in his lunchbox, how she never stopped believing in love, even when life was at its hardest. "You know what else she used to say?" Elijah asked. "She said that families are like gardens. They need love and patience, and sometimes they have to weather storms, but they can always grow back stronger." "She was right about that too," Richard said softly. "Look at us." That night, as Richard passed Elijah's room, he heard his son's nightly prayer. But this time, it was different. "Thank you, God, for helping Dad find his way back to me. And Mom. I think you were right about him all along." Richard leaned against the wall, his heart full. They'd come so far from that day in court, when a broken little boy had confronted a father who didn't know he existed. The path hadn't been easy, but every step had been worth it. The next morning, Elijah had another surprise. He'd started writing in the journal Richard had given him, and he wanted to share an entry. "Dear Mom," he read aloud, his voice steady. "I want you to know we're okay now. Dad and I found each other, just like you always said we would. He's not perfect. He still can't cook to save his life." Richard laughed through his tears. "But he loves me. He shows up every day, even when I'm angry or scared. He keeps his promises, and I think I'm ready to trust that he always will. Love, Elijah." Richard pulled his son into a tight hug. "I love you so much, buddy. I love you too, Dad. And I'm not scared anymore." As they stood there holding each other, the morning sun streamed through the window, casting warm light on the memory wall. Old photographs mingled with new ones, telling the story of a family lost and found, broken and rebuilt, stronger at the mended places. On Elijah's bedside table, the compass pendant caught the light, no longer needed as a reminder of the way home, because home was here, in the love between a father and son who had found their way back to each other. The past still lived in their hearts, in memories of Naomi's laugh, in the stories they shared, in the lessons she'd taught them both about love and forgiveness. But the future stretched before them, bright with promise and possibility. They were no longer a judge and a foster child, bound by tragedy and separated by lies. They were simply father and son, their bond strengthened by the very trials that had once threatened to keep them apart forever. As they went about their morning routine, Richard burning the toast, Elijah rolling his eyes and fixing it, both knew that while their journey hadn't ended, they would walk the rest of the path together. And somewhere, they both believed, Naomi was watching over them, her heart full of the joy she had always known was possible. The healing wasn't perfect. There would always be scars, always be moments of doubt or pain. But they had learned that love was stronger than fear, that trust could be rebuilt, that family was worth fighting for. Most importantly, they had learned what Naomi had known all along, that sometimes love doesn't disappear. It just gets lost, for a while. And when it finds its way back home, it's all the stronger for the journey. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing for more tales of healing, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds of family. Don't forget to like and share, because somewhere, someone needs to be reminded that even the deepest scars can fade when love finds its way home. But before you go, have you ever realized, too late, that you wounded your child's spirit with thoughtless words? And did you have the courage to look them in the eyes and ask for forgiveness? Let me know in the comments.